What is the evidence in terms of fasting? Are there true benefits, or is it more the calorie restriction from time restricted eating?
The balance of notice is telling us that it's mostly the calories. Now, that does not mean that the benefits aren't real. They're very real and they can be very impressive. Some people have, revolutionary results by fasting because of the weight loss and all these downstream benefits. And sometimes by fasting, people also remove some of the worst foods that they were eating. So a lot of the snacks and a lot of these foods that they would binge sometimes late at night or something like that, those are the ones that are removed instead of the main meals. And so that also contributes. So I don't think there's a contradiction. I think the benefits are absolutely real. I think fasting is a very valid approach that works really well for some people, works incredibly well for some people. Now, I wouldn't tell everyone that they have to go fast. Otherwise, they're hurting themselves. I think that logical leap is where I think influencers go too far. The results that we have don't point to any benefit of fasting that is independent from calories. There are questions around the time of eating, the chronobiology. That's a related but separate question. But fasting itself, just a block of time without eating, we don't have anything compelling that indicates that there's anything kind of magical or anything specific about fasting that's delivering that you can't get elsewhere. Even this idea of autophagy, which is very popular in the fasting community, you can get autophagy, you can activate autophagy by cutting calories as well. So caloric restriction or fasting, if equated for calories, you get autophagy in both. So, and the fact that we basically in these trials, when they match for calories, people fasting and people not fasting, you see similar changes. So this is telling us that it is probably via the calories, but that to me doesn't minimize the results that people get. By hook or by crook, the results are real and great. So for the people who do well on fasting, who like to integrate fasting, I often say it's out of the fads or out of the trends. It's my favorite one because it doesn't involve doing anything super dangerous or eating something crazy or, it's just, we're telling Westerners to eat a little bit less. And if you tell them to count calories or to eat less and move more, you're pilloried. But if you tell them to intermittently fast and do high intensity interval training, you're a genius. So, hey, whatever gets the result.
Yeah. You said there's a chronobiology. So is there value to circadian fasting or following your circadian rhythm?
So there is a bit of heterogeneity in the data. There are some trials that suggest that eating the same meals earlier in the day is a bit better metabolically. So really interesting studies looking at the same exact foods, but just shifted earlier versus shifted later. And they've even matched the fasting. So everybody's fasting the same amount of time. So everybody's eating, let's say, in an 8-hour window, for example, or 10-hour window, but that window gets shifted earlier in the day versus later in the day. And there are a few trials that show that there seem to be some benefits, maybe in terms of weight loss, in terms of insulin resistance, glucose metabolism type metrics to eating earlier in the day. And there is some circadian data supporting this. We tend to be a bit more insulin resistant late at night. So there might be something going on there. I should also say that there are trials that don't recapitulate this, but there are possible reasons. Sometimes the window is not as short as it could be. So people argue, okay, maybe they didn't just crunch the window long enough. So there are possible methodological reasons why it's not seen. I'm open to the possibility that eating foods earlier in the day is a bit better. I think what should be said is that, and this I think is agreed upon pretty much universally, is that if there is an effect of this circadianicity of eating earlier in the day, it is a much smaller effect than calories overall. So yeah, if you want to do this, I see no problem. But bear in mind that the overall caloric balance is going to be the main lever for weight maintenance and glucose metabolism and food quality. That's another caveat. I think sometimes people get hung up on the fasting and these new trends, and they forget the old things that we know. And as long as I'm fasting, then I'm going to eat this feast after. Sometimes people say the problem is not the fasting, it's the feasting. So it's as people fast for 4 hours, right? And then they feel like, okay, I worked really hard. Now I can reward myself. And they go and eat a really unhealthy meal. Not everybody does this, but it's a caveat. If you're eating unhealthy foods, probably you're undoing all the any benefit that you got from the fasting.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But I do think that some people do experience better sleep when they eat earlier because their body can, not be busy digesting their food. And so I think that may play a role in some of that chronicity as well. And then we know that overall sleep will boost testosterone, increased testosterone allows you to get more muscle mass. And so maybe there is something there. But again, I think you make a good point that if you're eating bad during your fasting window, even if it's or your feasting window, even if it's earlier in the day, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, you're kind of undoing the good. I have no problem with that. If people feel better for whatever reason, eating earlier in the day. As a night owl, I don't experience. I can't say that I experienced that, but I completely believe, and I don't see a problem if people want to shift their meals earlier in the day. If anything, it has evidence to support it.
I think in medical school, right, in our training, at least in the West, we learn very little about nutrition. I've gone on record. I've said this. I wish we knew more about nutrition because that's prevention, right? Nutrition is one of the pillars of health that we should be spending our time counseling patients on and helping them guide this issue. And because we're so I say all the time the Mediterranean diet is the most studied because that's accurate, right? It's the most studied. It has an abundance of data. But when someone comes to me and says, hey, I'm doing the carnivore diet, it's great, or I'm doing a raw foods vegan diet, it's great. I can only tell them what I know, which is minimal, right? Like I can't know everything about every single diet. But why do you think that we haven't adapted our training in medicine to really emphasize nutrition more?
I think it's a failure of the medical system, but also society. Why do we have this problem? I think we should be learning about nutrition, about the fundamentals from elementary school. It's so crucial. The fact that even professionals of health don't learn about it. And I completely agree with you. When I went to medical school, I learned precious little. There was maybe one class in my third year where we learned about what nutrients are, essential nutrients, vitamins, but it's so rudimentary. To me, it's crazy that we're not teaching everyone about this thing that everyone does and is so fundamental for health. And so many of the main causes of death of our society are critically influenced by what we eat. Massive failure, I think, of education in general, and then specifically for people who specialize in medicine and in health to not have that training is crazy. Now, what sometimes will happen, and I don't know if you have this experience, is doctors will work with registered dietitians. So they'll refer patients to an RD for more specialized nutrition advice. So I think that can work. It's kind of a compartmentalization of the advice or the competences. But yeah, so I don't think it's realistic for every doctor to be a specialist in depth of nutrition, but I think having a strong foundation would be critical. And even starting much earlier, I was reading this article about the education in Japan, and it's a key part of Japanese education starting in elementary school. So the kids eat together, they present foods to classmates, and they talk about nutrition at the age of like 6 or 7. So it starts young. And so here we have almost the opposite, where the foods that are served in schools are the worst kind, and the foods that are served sometimes in hospitals are the worst kind. So we really don't have an institutional support for something that should be so essential. And then, of course, we pay the tab later on in terms of diseases and early death. Yeah, I don't know. I guess everybody agrees with this, but how do we change the system is the tricky part. I think part of it is giving medical students this information. I have a number of viewers who are medical students or researchers of other fields. But yeah, I think until we have, and we've given some lectures actually to medical schools and nursing schools, kind of touching on some of these topics. So I'm always really excited when I get an invitation to do something like that, which happens occasionally, but not as much as it should. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Let's get this YouTuber to give a 1 hour thing. It should be, here's this curriculum of nutrition over the 4 years of medical school, right? Um, so yeah, I don't know exactly how we change the system, but I think it's, if we don't, we're in dire straits.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, if you go to your doctor and ask them about nutrition, you may get a paltry response because depending on the doctor and their, historical experience in the nutrition space and how much self-learning they do. As you mentioned, even you learned so much from studying seed oils, for example. But like I learn every day when I'm creating content and reading research and, trying to find things out for my patients. And I think that like there's some doctors who don't do that, don't have time for that, have very busy practices or seeing 50 patients a day, whatever it is. And so they know what they know and they don't have time to delve into these topics in detail. And so they may not have a great answer for you. That doesn't mean that I think in general, they're not, they're going to tell you the basics, right? Which is maybe move more, eat less, or calories in, calories out, and that may be frustrating when you're seeing all these things on social media saying it's not just that. But is it? Is it just that? Do you think it's just calories in, calories out? Is that a reasonable response?
I think it's a very incomplete response, and it's not particularly actionable for most people. That's why we have this clash. It's not that it's incorrect. It's that it doesn't tell people what to do. It's like telling people, "Oh, you're poor, make more money." It's not actionable. It doesn't help me. Calories in, calories out is basically, it's explaining the mechanism, but how do people get there? You have to give people tools to implement in real life. That's where this type of advice is not good. And that's where things like, oh, fast, stop eating at 4 p.m. and cut all the carbs from your diet, cut all the fat from your diet. These things sometimes are overhyped. Some of them are not particularly based on strong evidence in terms of saying that all carbohydrate is bad or all fat is bad. But what they are is very actionable and very effective, at least for some people. And very simple. You explain that in 5 seconds. Here's what you do. Everything with carbohydrate now is poison. Eliminate that from your diet. You eliminate most foods that you're eating on a typical Western diet. It's a radical elimination diet. You lose weight. Same with low fat. Same with all of these different things. The Twinkie diet, all these things where you're only supposed to eat one thing. Sooner or later, you're fed up with that thing. You're nauseated, and you stop eating. You're not eating 3,000 calories, and you lose weight. What we need to do, and this is the challenge, and I think it behooves us who, we're taking on the challenge, you and me and so many others, where we're trying to bridge scientific knowledge with the public, and it's not easy. But it's I think our task to come up with something that is evidence-based and empowering and actionable, that gives people the results short-term, but also supports their long-term health, that we don't shortchange them for kind of a popular crash diet. Not easy. I'm not pretending to have the magic recipe, but that's essentially what I try to do with my content. And it's changing over the years as I get feedback, as I learn more from viewers also. And it's kind of this dance, right? I'd love to hear also your experience you have a much larger platform than I do. So maybe you have other insights that I haven't even gotten to.
Yeah, I think you have to meet people where they are, and people are all over the place in terms of what they're ready to change about their life. And you're right. I think sometimes getting on a diet that you enjoy, right? Like say you really like meat and you're like, oh, the carnivore diet is great. It gives me all the things I like and I get to lose weight. And and like you could be like, okay, how can we make this healthier, right? How can we make this version of your diet healthier? What are the things that you eat? And, taking it like sort of in an atomic habits sort of way, take one small change at a time and incrementally do that till you get to a diet that is sustainable, long lasting, and that you can actually maintain for years on end. I think that's sort of the challenge with some of these diets is, yeah, you can do them for 2 years, maybe 3 years even. But at some point, you're like, you know what? I just want to eat a piece of pizza, or I just want to eat a piece of bread, and like, I can't do it anymore. Right. So
Right.
I think it's sort of meeting people where they are and making these incremental changes that are very individualized, because as you mentioned, people are very individualized, and they may have sensitivities, and they may have issues, and they may have poor sleep, and they may have other things that you have to take into consideration. And that's where, the stuff we do is great. We give general information to people, but it's not applicable to every single individual. I mean, the overall sort of pillars of information are applicable, but there's individual nuance that we can't get on when we're talking on social media.
Completely agree with that. That's something that, especially with nutrition, where there's so much variation. I'll make a video going over a topic, and invariably I'll get people saying, well, but I experienced something different. And someone else will be on the other end of the spectrum. So that's been a learning experience for me, trying to make content that communicates the pillars of the evidence, but at the same time, kind of trying to help people, try to individualize a little bit, although it's so limited because if you're talking to however many thousands of people, you can't personalize at any meaningful level. So you're always kind of generalizing a bit. But what we said about sustainability long term is so crucial. And this is a common pattern that we see with these trials, with all of these diets, by the way, the low fat, the low carb, the vegan, all of these interventions. After a certain period, from 6 months to a year, around there, people just start falling off the wagon like crazy with all of these diets, even when they get really impressive results initially. Even with the results, it's not enough for most people to stick to these diets. This is something that has really stuck with me from looking at these trials, whether it's, and even things that aren't randomized, where it's targeted to help people with a specific dietary pattern, and all the investigators are motivated and believe in that diet, and you still see long-term, over 2 years, 3 years, terrible sustainability as a whole. And then there's always the 5% or 10% or whatever percentage of people that do stick with the diet and love it. And those, I think, become the evangelizers on social media that are very angry that they're not being listened to because, hey, it works so well for me. How come everybody isn't doing the same thing? And again, there's a nugget of truth there that it did work for them and they were able to stick with it. But unfortunately, this change of habit with food specifically, it's so difficult for most people to sustain. So there, I think, is another challenge, is how to get people to stick to these changes. That's where another, somewhat, you could argue it's an advantage of a Mediterranean style pattern, traditional Mediterranean, because it's a bit closer to what people are used to. It's a mix of foods, and it's not super low fat or super low carb. You're not completely eliminating any food group. So perhaps a little easier for the average person to attain to that in the long run than these more extreme varieties.
If you enjoyed this clip of the Rena Malik MD podcast, make sure to check out the full episode with Dr. Gil Carvalho right here.